guys, TJ here with Dead History, and welcome back to the next installment of our presidential series. This is actually part 2, taking a look at our 11th president of the United States. Who's that, Henry?
JamesKPolk.
Yep, and I'm here with my son, Henry. Say hi.
Hi.
So yes, looking at JamesKPolk. Let's jump right in here. So we left off with after he was well enough and able to, he went to the University of North Carolina and graduated with honors. And then JamesKPolk, he actually won a seat on the Tennessee legislature at the age of 27. And he became a U.S. House of Representative at the age of 29. So very young ages that he was involved and started his political career. During his time in the state legislature, he met and befriended the future president, Andrew Jackson. He also began courting his future wife, Sarah Childress, the daughter of a prominent planter. She had been educated at the prestigious Moravian Female Academy in Salem, North Carolina, and was an eager and active participant in his political campaigns. Interesting thing, Polk and Sarah, they married in 1824. In 1825, Polk was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, as I said, where he would actually serve for 14 years. An interesting little fact with him and Jackson, he earned the nickname, Polk did, Young Hickory, because of his support of Andrew Jackson, who was obviously known as
Old Hickory.
Old Hickory, that's right, Henry. So when Jackson won the presidency in 1828, Polk's star was on the rise, and he became quite powerful in Congress. He actually served as Speaker of the House from 1835 to 1839, and he only left Congress to become the governor of Tennessee. So, pretty cool stuff. Also, another really, really fun, interesting fact about JamesKPolk, he was actually the first what you would consider a dark horse candidate, or really an unknown candidate for president. His nomination for president surprised everyone, actually including even himself.
What?
Yeah, so Polk was not expected to run for president in 1844. Martin Van Buren, he wanted to be nominated for a second term as president, but his stance against the annexation of Texas was very unpopular with the Democratic Party. So months before the Democratic National Convention of 1844, Polk was kind of at a low point. He had just lost his bid to be reelected governor of Tennessee. He had been voted out of office in 1841 and tried and failed to be elected again in 1843. But when the delegates at the Democratic Convention couldn't agree on a nominee, the delegates went through 9 ballots before compromising to basically pick Polk for president. The party was, really, they were deadlocked between Martin Van Buren and a gentleman by the name of Lewis Cass. So right here, who's on the screen right now, that's Lewis Cass. They eventually, like I said, they compromised, picking what you would consider a dark horse candidate in JamesKPolk. So pretty interesting stuff there. Nobody expected him, including himself, to really ever be president. So pretty cool. Everyone thought really that Polk would lose the bid for presidency. Despite him being a 7-time congressman, a former Speaker of the House, as I said, and an ex-governor of Tennessee, Polk really was a relative nobody. Nobody really knew who he was. His opponent, Henry Clay, who many people knew, who some historians will tell you at the time was one of the most well-known political figures in America, Henry Clay. Henry Clay lamented that Democrats had failed to choose someone, quote-unquote, more worthy of a contest. Clay was actually opposed to the annexation of Texas, and the election of 1844 really did center around the issue of the annexation of Texas, which was then an independent republic after it gained independence from Mexico in 1836. President John Tyler, who was obviously the predecessor to Polk, he was the 10th president, he was a very strong supporter of the annexation of Texas. So his support, combined with Polk's popularity, meant that the annexation measure passed 3 days before John Tyler's term in office ended. I mentioned that in Tyler's video that I did last week. He was a big proponent of the annexation, and he got it passed just a few days before he left office. So despite all the doubts, though, Polk won the popular vote by nearly 40,000 votes. And Clay and Polk, Henry Clay and James Polk, they basically ended up receiving 50% of the popular vote. It was really split, but it was by about 40,000 popular votes that Polk won. And then Polk won the Electoral College 170 to 105. So pretty surprising, but he became our 11th president of the United States. And Henry Clay, of course, who ran for president several times and never won. So just yet another disappointment for Henry Clay. So during James Polk's White House, the office hours, anyone could stop by the White House. During his day, anybody was permitted to visit the White House for what he considered office hours. For 2 days every week, concerned citizens, lobbyists, they could drop by to vouch for a cause or ask for political favors from the president himself. Job seekers were the worst in Polk's view, and he found their incessant interruptions far more annoying than his Whig opponents in Congress. So that is something that James Polk once said, that people looking for a job were more annoying to him than even opponents that he had in politics. So pretty interesting thing there. James Polk, he actually worked 12-hour days, and he didn't take much time off from the presidency. He regularly spent 12 hours a day at the office. He rarely left Washington. He took advice or delegated. When he wanted to lobby for policy, he'd visit Congress and do it himself. Over the course of his one single term, he took a total of just 27 days off. So in 4 years, he only took 27 days off. No president who performs his duty faithfully and consciously can have any leisure, Polk once wrote. So he was a very big proponent of never taking off, never going and playing golf, or any of those sort of things that we sometimes see current presidents do. Another thing about Polk actually acquired what is America's first patch of Pacific coastline. In the early 19th century, the Pacific Northwest was jointly occupied by the British and American settlers. But as the century progressed, Americans began to outnumber the British, and they increasingly felt like the rightful owners of the Oregon country. So thankfully, neither country was interested in battling over the land, and in 1846, Polk and the British drew a border at the 49th parallel, with some adjustment for Vancouver Island up there, what is now Washington State's boundary with Canada. So with that, the United States obtained its first uncontested patch of Pacific coastline. Actually, there was a kind of an interesting little thing. 54-40 or fight was one of Polk's campaign pledges, was put to an end, to end the boundary disputes in Oregon between the U.S. and Great Britain. Polk's supporters actually took up that rallying cry, 54-40 or fight. It was referring to the northernmost latitude of the Oregon Territory. So pretty interesting little fact there about Polk and his supporters. James Polk also, he's the reason, like I said, that the United States basically stretches from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Just in one term, because that's all he did, he oversaw one of the greatest territorial expansions of any president. He increased our country by 1.2 million square miles. They extended the boundary to the Pacific Ocean, and his administration and Polk himself, they really laid the groundwork for states such as California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and the state that Henry was born in, which is what? Montana, that's right. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. And then we're kind of going to touch on here, of course, what was known as Mr. Polk's War. So in April of 1846, Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande and they killed 11 U.S. soldiers. This came as part of a revolt against the Mexican president who was considering America's bid to buy California. The soldiers basically were angered about the lands that they felt were taken through the annexation of Texas, and the Rio Grande was an area of border dispute. So basically, Polk waged really what is known as a controversial and consequential war with Mexico. Mexico's border, it encompassed California, the American Southwest, even parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Polk, of course, really wanted this land. He was very, very adamant about that. He wanted this for the United States. In 1845, he offered to buy some of the disputed territory near the Texas-Mexico border, as well as land in California. And then, of course, when Mexico refused that, Polk actually sent troops into the disputed territory near the Rio Grande, and that's when Mexico retaliated, like I said. And by May 13th of that year, the U.S., we had officially declared war on Mexico. And critics of the war, they called it Mr. Polk's War. So yeah, it was basically, it wasn't very popular overall. Polk requested that Congress declare war when obviously the Mexican troops had killed those soldiers. His critics were in Congress, where John Quincy Adams was very opposed to this, and a young man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. That's right, Henry. They complained that Polk had deliberately provoked Mexico. So basically, whatever the Polk's motivations were, the United States ended up losing 13,000 men and approximately $100 million in the war. But we did succeed in taking 1/3 of Mexico's land in the Mexican-American War. So even though we ended up winning and we ended up getting expansion out of it, it is a very controversial war. It is one that a lot of people, historians and such, this is kind of a blemish, you could say, on Polk's presidency and that sort of thing. So interesting stuff. So the term manifest destiny, that was actually coined by John O'Sullivan in 1845. In his argument, in O'Sullivan's argument for the annexation of Texas, he called it the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence. So in other words, he was saying that America had a God-given right to extend from sea to shining sea. And Polk was president at the height of this furor and helped extend America with both, of course, the negotiations for the Oregon Territory boundary and what is known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And I will obviously touch on that now. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it ended the Mexican-American War. That was what ended it. And it formally fixed the boundary between Texas and Mexico at the Rio Grande. In addition, the U.S. was able to acquire both California and Nevada in this treaty. So this was the greatest increase in U.S. land since Thomas Jefferson negotiated, which, of course, was the Louisiana Purchase. America, we actually agreed to pay Mexico $15 million for the territory. So lots of money. But pretty interesting stuff. Interesting facts there. The reality is that Polk, he's the reason that we stretch from Atlantic Ocean to Pacific Ocean. There's no doubt about it. Like I said, he was very, 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 very influential in this, and he did make it happen. So, another thing, Polk is one of these guys in history, one of these presidents that there's really mixed feelings on him, depending on who you ask. One of the really bad things about Polk, of course, he was an enslaver, so, bad. He was kind of mixed on slavery. He was an enslaver himself, and really what it was his ambivalence toward the issue of slavery. It really may have sparked the Civil War, inevitably. When Polk's administration began pushing westward, the debate raged over how these new territories could alter the power balance between free and slave states. Polk, who considered slavery, he considered it a side issue. He refused to give the rancor much time or attention. No doubt because of his own relationship with slavery. He owned more than 20 enslaved people, and he actually brought them to the White House. So, as you can see, Polk, he was all for slavery. He was an enslaver himself. He brought slaves to the White House with him. And he just didn't do anything about slavery. He just kind of pushed it aside. So really, Polk's ambivalence, it helped so much discord that historians really now consider his rapid expansion westward as the first steps toward what we know as the Civil War. So pretty crazy stuff. So yeah, Polk, an enslaver, not good. Very, very bad about slavery, James Polk. Pretty much ignored it and probably ended up kick-starting the Civil War, inevitably. So, another fun fact, James Polk, he actually signed bills that reshaped Washington, D.C. Polk accomplished a lot in just 4 years. During his tenure, he signed the Smithsonian Institution into law. He was instrumental to the construction of the Washington Monument, and he helped establish the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. He also reestablished an independent U.S. Treasury, which was partly intended to reduce the role of speculation in the economy. So he actually did do several, pretty good things on top of the things that he didn't do so well, of course. Polk's administration also introduced Americans to the postage stamp. One of Polk's unofficial campaign managers, named Cave Johnson, who Polk rewarded with a job as Postmaster General. This is actually a photo right here of Cave Johnson. It was a tough gig. The post office's budget was swimming in red ink. At the time, mail recipients paid postage. If a mail carrier failed to find a recipient, no money was made. This happened a lot, too, back then. So Cave Johnson fixed the financial problem by introducing the prepaid postage stamp, which flipped the responsibility of paying to senders. And there was, according to a historian named C.L. Grant, in 1845, Johnson estimated that the department would have a deficit of over $1 million, but by the time he left, that was down to $30,000. So pretty remarkable, actually. Pretty interesting stuff. James Polk's wife, Sarah, she was actually the first presidential spouse to host Thanksgiving dinner in the White House. So Sarah, she was the first host of Thanksgiving. Pretty cool thing there. Another thing to kind of touch on with Polk, he was actually extremely and remarkably a boring man. He didn't drink in public or at dinner parties, and this was kind of poked fun at. No pun intended, poked fun. Polk, he had about as much charisma as a puddle of mud, to be honest. He was straight-laced, he was somber, he was humorless. As speaker, an editor in Washington called him the most unpretending man for his talents this or perhaps any country has ever seen. So yeah, some attributed Polk's boringness with, like I said, his refusal to drink socially. The politician Sam Houston supposedly called him, Polk that is, a victim of the use of water as a beverage. And Sarah, his wife, she actually banned hard liquor and dancing from the White House. So, as you can see, pretty vanilla, pretty boring and kind of plain guy. Not that you need to drink to have fun, but he was known as a pretty boring guy. So, interesting stuff. And then, of course, what else can I tell you here before I get into his grave? As far as Polk's legacy goes, one thing that Polk did is he actually did everything that he said he was going to do during his campaign. Everything that he said and promised he would do, he actually ended up doing. He lived up to all his promises, all his plans. He also said he would only serve one term, and he actually did just that. He only served one term. So, pretty interesting. It's really hard to say where he falls in, historical greatness or legacy. Obviously, slavery, the Mexican-American War are big blemishes on Polk's record. But he did do several things, that weren't so bad as well. So it's kind of an interesting mix. I've heard many historians say that, if you give him a grade from A to F, he's more like closer to an F. He's like a D. But then I've heard historians say he's probably more like a B or B+. So it all depends. It's all open to interpretation, of course. And last but not least, Henry's going to chime in here because the location of James Polk's grave is causing a stir yet again in Tennessee. Polk died likely of cholera. Cholera is basically an infection, a bacterial infection of the small intestines. He died in 1849, just months after leaving office. As a matter of fact, as I touched on, James Polk had the shortest retirement of any U.S. president in history. He was done with his presidency, and then 103 days later, he died. So, because he died of an infectious disease, the president he was very hastily buried in a city cemetery near the outskirts of Nashville, Tennessee. Months later, he was reinterred near his Nashville mansion, Polk Place. In 1893, his tomb was moved again to the state capitol grounds in Nashville. And today, Tennessee legislators are actively debating whether to move Polk's bones for a fourth time. Yep. Basically, they want to move him to his old family home in Columbia, Tennessee. And kind of the story goes, after attending the inauguration of Zachary Taylor on March 5th, 1849, Polk and his wife Sarah, they left by horse and carriage to their new home, Polk Place, in Nashville. And upon arriving there at Polk Place, Polk was very disappointed to find out that it was not fully finished or completed yet. So then they went from Nashville to Columbia to spend 2 weeks with James Polk's mother before going to spend a few days in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, with Sarah's family before they returned back to Nashville. And then 3 months later, Polk died of cholera. Like I said, he had the shortest presidency retirement of anyone. And according to a very large amount of traditional accounts and historians, Polk's very last words before he died were, "I love you, Sarah, for all eternity, I love you." Obviously, Sarah being his wife, he was very fond of. Some interesting stuff. So back to his grave a little bit. A much-debated resolution urging that his remains be moved for a fourth time. It actually was knocked down in March of 2018. The Tennessee legislature, they actually voted it, the House there in Tennessee, they voted it 51 to 37. No, I'm sorry. They knocked it down in March of 2018. And then in April of 2018, only a month later, it was actually resurrected, the position to move the grave, and it actually won final approval by the House with a vote of 51 to 37. This was in April of 2018. So who knows? Lawmakers basically in support of the move has said it's only right that the former president and his wife be buried at their family home in Columbia, Tennessee. They note that because his mansion has since been razed, the Polk home and museum grounds are now the most suitable resting place because that is where his legacy resides. So I mean, there's actually a representative. His name is Rick Tillis from Lewisburg, Tennessee. I'm not sure if he's still a representative, but in 2018 he was, and he's quoted as saying, "The Polk home is the only building in Tennessee to which James Polk had any personal connection." So you got to consider this because it should be the logical final resting place for him, should be his home. The Tennessee Historical Commission and the State Capitol Commission and Chancery Court, they would still have to approve the bill. And like I said, this was in April of 2018, and that was the last I had actually heard about this. So they have not moved it yet, and I have not heard any update in the past 3 years almost. So who knows what's going on with it. As of right now, as you see with all these pictures that have been going on the screen, he's laid to rest in Nashville, Tennessee at the State Capitol building. What else? I do actually want to read a little something about his resting places. So give me 1 second so I can actually read an excerpt for you. So what I wanted to read, of course, is just a little bit about his death sites, because there's been several. I know the video is getting long, but I do want to read this real quick. So Polk's funeral was held at McKendree Methodist Church, but the house of worship there today is not the same one. The current building that's there is actually the fourth on the site. The original church was built in 1833, and it actually hosted Polk's funeral in 1849. So interesting. So the first burial site when he died, because like I said, they had to hastily kind of bury him, was at the Nashville City Cemetery. The picturesque Nashville City Cemetery has the distinction of being the oldest continuously operated cemetery in Nashville. And the plot was there where he was originally buried in 1849. So, actually, it says the plot where Polk was buried is located with an iron fence among graves from the Grundy and Winder families ranging from 1828 to 1891. There is no historic marker nor mention in the cemetery brochure to let people know that President James Polk was once buried there. That's pretty interesting stuff. Now, Polk Place, that's the home where he died, and it was the location of his second grave. The home where Polk died was built in 1815 by his friend and mentor, Felix Grundy. So basically, let me see here. So yeah, that's where he went for a second time. So originally Nashville Cemetery, and then they moved him to Polk Place where he died and where his home was at. And then finally, the third resting place where he's at currently is the Tennessee State Capitol. The third and final burial site for Polk is located on the grounds of the Tennessee State Capitol. It's on Charlotte Avenue in Nashville, Tennessee. Today it's located on the right toward the back on the building, so it's where it is basically overshadowed, and it's very overshadowed by a huge statue of Andrew Jackson on horseback. Actually, I showed you guys that statue in my Andrew Jackson video. That's literally 15 yards or so, 20 yards from Polk's tomb, and it really does kind of overshadow Polk's tomb. It does. When the grave was first erected, the entrance to the State House was on the side, and the carriage path up the hill took visitors right past Polk's grave. That's obviously when it was originally put there. So we will see what the fate of James Polk's grave is moving forward. Obviously, it's in flux, and they think he should be going to Columbia, Tennessee, to his home, but we shall see what happens. So that was a look at the life and legacy of our 11th president, James Knox Polk. James Knox Polk. Listen to me. James Knox Polk. Excuse me. And I hope you enjoyed this. We always enjoy doing these videos. So, yeah, we really do enjoy, the videos and doing this for you guys.
Yep.
Right, Henry?
Yes, of course.
And we thank you for stopping in. We know that the second part of our videos have actually tended to be a little long, but, we would rather break it up into two videos, and, we hope you're enjoying them.
Yes.
So, if you guys think that we should be doing them in 3 parts of like 12 minutes each or something like that, or 10 minutes each, let us know in the comments below. But I don't know how many people really want 3 videos of presidents like John Tyler or James Polk or anything. So, thanks for stopping in and joining us.
Yep.
Stay tuned for next week. We'll look at the 12th president of the United States, who is
Zachary Taylor.
Yep. What's his nickname, Henry?
Old Rough and Ready.
Old Rough and Ready, Zachary Taylor. Very good, buddy. But thanks for stopping in. Subscribe. Leave those comments. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.